Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Great to see so many people here. I'm Jamil Jaffer. I'm the director of the Knight Institute. As many of you already know, the Knight Institute was established 6 years ago to defend the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. We do that work through research, public education, and litigation. We're here this evening to address one of the most urgent threats to press freedom today, the unregulated trade in spyware. Around the world, authoritarian and other rights-abusing regimes are using malicious surveillance software to intimidate and silence journalists, and not just journalists, but human rights advocates, political dissidents, and other civil society actors as well. The unrestricted availability of powerful surveillance technology has been a great gift to the world's least scrupulous governments. Until very recently, spyware manufacturers operated with impunity, even as their technology facilitated terrible abuses. But it's possible that this is beginning, if only beginning, to change. The Biden administration has sanctioned a handful of spyware manufacturers from Singapore, Russia, and Israel, including NSO Group, whose Pegasus technology has been implicated in some of the gravest abuses. The European Parliament has established a committee of inquiry to consider what uses of spyware violate EU law, and the victims of spyware attacks have now filed lawsuits in multiple countries, including Hungary, Spain, and the UK. Late last year, the Knight Institute filed suit against NSO Group here in the United States. We brought the suit on behalf of 15 members of Faro, which is, as most of you already know, one of the leading sources of independent news in Central America. You're going to be hearing tonight from Carlos Dada, Faro's publisher, as well as Carrie DeSalle, who has been leading the Faro litigation for the Knight Institute. I want to say that it's been an incredible privilege for those of us at the Knight Institute to represent Carlos and his colleagues. If you've read Ronan Farrow's riveting and deeply reported piece for The New Yorker, you already know that Carlos and his team at Faro are truly some of the most courageous journalists in the world, speaking truth to power in the most difficult conditions imaginable. It's important for you to know that the lawsuit we filed on behalf of Faro would not have been possible but for the work of many others. I want to mention in particular Ron Diebert and his team at Citizen Lab, whose forensic investigations have provided much of the evidentiary record we rely on in our suit. The work that Citizen Lab has done, often alongside other organizations, including Access Now and Amnesty International Security Lab, has been absolutely invaluable. We're fortunate that Professor Sheila Coronel has agreed to moderate tonight's conversation. Professor Coronel is the Tony Sabalay Professor of Professional Practice in Investigative Journalism here at Columbia. She reported in the Philippines during the twilight of the Marcos dictatorship and founded the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, whose reporting led to the fall of President Joseph Estrada in 2001. 2 years later, she won Asia's premier prize, the Ramon Magsaysay Award. She's written or edited a dozen books and trained hundreds of investigative journalists. I can't think of anyone more equipped to lead tonight's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Coronel, as well as Carlos Dada, Carrie DeSalle, and Ronan Farrow.
Thank you, Jamil. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good evening to all of you. We already know, all of you are in this room because you know journalism is under threat. But we probably don't know how much that threat has morphed through the years. Tonight, we're not just going to talk about threats. Tonight will be about fighting back against those threats. And the people in this panel are at the forefront of fighting back against a very pernicious, new and sophisticated threat against independent journalism. And that's the threat of spyware, of digital surveillance. I'll introduce them by first asking each of them questions. So I'd like to ask Carlos Dada first. As Jamil said, he's the co-founder and publisher of Faro, at the forefront of very brave investigative journalism about gangs, drug cartels, abuse of power in Central America. So I'll ask Carlos. Carlos, why are we here today? And why is it that you've decided, first of all, what is El Faro? Tell us about the reporting you've done and why that has made you vulnerable to all sorts of attack. I know over the years, this is only the latest in many forms of attack on El Faro. And then, how are you fighting back?
I have no idea.
You just put this thing up. This click up.
Hola, hola. Yes. Thank you, Sheila, for moderating this conversation. Thank you, Jamil, for your generous words. And thanks to the Knight First Amendment Institute for all the wonderful work you've done for this case to go through. And thank you, Ronan, for that great piece that sheds light on the situation. I would like to believe not only on our situation, but us as a vehicle to tell the situation of thousands of journalists all around the world that are being targeted with spyware that is meant to be used to fight terrorism, not journalism or not human rights activism. El Faro is a Central American publication that turns 25 years old this year. It's based in San Salvador, El Salvador. And we've been doing a lot of investigative journalism over these years that have to do with war crimes, with corruption, with human rights abuses, with migration, with drug trafficking, and all the nice things that happen in Central America. I guess a way to put it in few lines is we like to see ourselves as people that do journalism from a very critical position at power. So yes, over the years we've received a lot of threats. Right now we have cautionary measures from the Inter-American Human Rights Commission that concluded that our work and our lives are at risk from power, of course, from political power. We found out that we had 22 members out of the 30 people that are employees of El Faro were infected by Pegasus during a period of a year and a half. We found this out thanks to the organizations that Jamil already mentioned: Access Now, Citizen Lab, Amnesty International. Why do they do this? Of course, first of all, well, I don't know, but I do believe that they wanted to see who we were talking to, who are our sources. And professionally, that was mainly the biggest consequence of publishing that we had been infected with Pegasus. Because who wants to talk to you when the government is listening to the phone calls and have all the way to identify you? But of course, the complaint that we are filing with the Knight First Amendment Institute, that is why it is so important that it gives us a lot of agency in terms that we are not journalists just crying in a corner because we have been targeted, defenseless. We are trying to defend our rights at a US federal court because our privacy has been invaded, because our work has been obstructed. And we believe that journalism is a matter of public interest. It's not only about us, it's about the right to have information from the public. I'm going to leave it there.
So I'll ask Ronan Faro, award-winning journalist from The New Yorker, himself been the target of surveillance as he documented in Catch and Kill book and a podcast series. So Ronan, give us the big picture here. We first knew about Pegasus and NSO, at least for most of us, when around 2021, when a group of journalists from all around the world exposed the surveillance of like 50,000 cell phones based on a leak from, we believe, inside NSO. So what is the big picture here? How widespread is this problem? Why should we be worried about it? And how do you go about reporting on something so stealthy and so sinister?
You're exactly right how you laid it out when we sat down. Journalism is under attack right now, and there are a lot of sources of the obstacles we face today. But this is one of the most pernicious, and it's becoming one of the most widespread. All of us in this room, I assume, buy into the premise that the Fourth Estate is essential for all its foibles in defending our basic rights and democracies around the world and holding the powerful to account. And this phenomenon, the fact that every phone, every device in every journalist's pocket is a ticking time bomb that can expose their sources, is tremendously damaging to that basic framework of rights and accountability. So it's a problem of paramount importance for every reporter, and I see some journalists out here today, and for every person who lives in a country that needs the free press. Reporting on it isn't easy, because this is an industry that is so wildly unregulated considering how dangerous the tools that it sells are. Because this is nascent enough that a lot of the companies at the forefront of what's now a $12 billion industry have been able to get away with saying, hey, we got to rely on trade secrecy practices. We can't reveal our clients. We can't know anything about who they target. NSO Group in particular has pulled this trick over and over and over again in the press, saying, we don't know anything about who our customers target. So not only are you not going to know which countries we're selling to, you're not going to know who they're looking at, because we can't know. We can't see that traffic. We don't know what data is going through the servers. And there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of that claim, but without getting into the technical side of that conversation, a very basic inconsistency is this. If you really press them on this, two arguments emerge which are in direct conflict. One is, we're putting in place all of these new accountability measures. We have new oversight boards. This is NSO Group likes to tout this all the time. The moment we catch an infraction, the moment we become aware of a journalist or a dissident being targeted, we're going to shut down that account. And they like to give a list of, we've shut down 10 customer accounts. But at the same time, they're arguing we can't know anything about the underlying traffic. So there's a real tension there, and I think we still have to get to an intellectually honest conversation between the people in the industry, the regulators, and the segment of the press, a lot of it represented here, that is trying to hold this industry to account. The core truth here is this problem isn't going away. These are powerful tools. They do have legitimate law enforcement applications, theoretically. The genie's not going back in the bottle. This technology is getting more and more accessible and cheaper and cheaper. Just last month, in recent days, we saw the New York Attorney General crack down on a bunch of companies that aren't selling to governments. They're marketing to jealous spouses. So this is about to break out into the wider culture in a much more prevalent way that's even beyond the journalism conversation, but it should start here with the journalists.
Well, tell us about, NSO is one of many companies engaged in this. Tell us about how many, NSO, how many countries? What is the global scale of this? And who's being targeted apart from journalists?
Well, the best data we have suggests that Pegasus specifically, NSO's flagship tool, is being used in 45 countries. That's one figure that's been published. NSO obviously says they won't say.
Democracies or autocracies?
Well, this is a big question. NSO likes to characterize its client base as being primarily oriented around Western democracies, sleepy countries with legitimate and unbothersome law enforcement objectives. And I have talked to officials in countries of that type that use NSO's tools. And of course, if you're talking to the chief of police in a country like that, oftentimes they're a little more concerned with getting the best and coolest toys that are as intrusive as possible, rather than the civil liberties implications. So that is real. But what happens when you talk to people who are able to pull back the veil of secrecy, people, for instance, involved in NSO's sales process, is they tell you the bread and butter is actually dictatorships, repressive regimes. And a company like NSO can charge far more to a client like Saudi Arabia, which a lot of information suggests has historically been on their client list. There's reason to believe maybe that account has been terminated, but for a long time that was the archetypal example. That brings in an order of magnitude more money. So there is built into this industry, as of now, in its currently unregulated state, a natural perverse incentive structure where these companies, assuming their business model is going after all governments everywhere for business, are going to spend a lot of time and energy catering to exactly the kinds of regimes that trigger these problems we're talking about here today.
So let's have Carrie weigh in here about, you've exposed what NSO is doing. A lot of journalists around the world have done the same thing. You've exposed what's happened to El Faro. But I'd like to ask Carrie DeSalle. She's a senior staff attorney at the Knight First Amendment Institute and a lecturer at the Columbia Law School, focused primarily on free speech issues. I'd like to ask Carrie, aside from exposure, what else can journalists do? And can you talk about this particular case, why it was filed in the United States, and what you hope will be the outcome of this case?
Sure. I mean, for one thing, journalists can follow Carlos and his colleagues' lead and sue NSO Group in U.S. court. We brought this lawsuit in the United States because one crucial feature of the technology that NSO Group offers its clients is the ability to infect Apple devices using WhatsApp and other very commonly used apps. So using these US technology companies' software and services to infect as many possible phones around the world. And so the US in general and US courts in specific have a crucial role to play in holding NSO Group accountable for the attacks against Carlos, for the attacks against his colleagues, and for the attacks against other journalists, human rights activists around the world that importantly used these US technology companies' infrastructure to deliver those attacks. More fundamentally, this case is about individual rights and fundamental freedoms, the right to privacy, the freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and courts are a proper place to defend those rights. So in this case in particular, what we're hoping to obtain is not only an order from the court holding that NSO Group violated US law when it participated in the attacks and facilitated the attacks against El Faro, but also an order requiring NSO Group to disclose its client, the client that ordered the attacks against El Faro. And we think this is incredibly important because in addition to the ability to infect a significant number of phones around the world, one of the most important things that NSO Group offers its clients is secrecy. They tell its clients that the use of Pegasus cannot be traced back to them in any particular instance. And we hope that by winning this case and obtaining that order, NSO Group will be forced to disclose the client in this case, and that will send a message to other government actors around the world that they can't rely on NSO Group's assurances of secrecy.
So you're hoping that the court case will have a deterrent effect, that it will discourage companies like NSO from selling? You really think they will stop selling their software?
Well, if they know that they're subject to US legal liability for selling this kind of software to bad actors around the world, then yes, we think that'll have a significant deterrent effect.
So, Carlos, in talking about deterrent effect, did exposing what NSO did deter Salvadoran authorities from conducting further surveillance on El Faro?
El Salvador is not a democracy anymore. The president has concentrated all the power, which means he controls the Attorney General's office, the Circuit of Judges, the Supreme Court, Congress, the Army, the police, and all the intelligence units in the country. There is no possibility of legitimate defense anymore in El Salvador. When we published this, they didn't answer to us. They answered to a reporter from Reuters saying this was not us. Our case had something very special. When Citizen Lab was analyzing the phone of one of my colleagues, of Carlos Martinez, they saw the operation of the agent live. When they were examining it, someone was entering the phone. That allowed Citizen Lab to determine exactly the location of the agent. And it was El Salvador, not surprisingly. NSO claims that it only sells Pegasus to governments or security forces, legitimate national security forces, which basically means that we were targeted by a government that is in El Salvador, right? That's who used Pegasus against us. But the Salvadoran government says they didn't do it. And no, it can't be a deterrent in a country where there's no balances in power. 2 weeks ago, we published another story. We found out through a bunch of emails that were hacked and finished on our table that the police was buying more spyware from Israeli companies also through an Israeli former Israeli Armed Forces special agent in Mexico, Yaniv Sangilevich, who is an intermediary selling the police more spyware. How is it being used? We don't know because there are no controls over this. So no, it has not served as a deterrent. But this complaint that we have filed in this federal court in California, that's why it's so important. This is the first complaint, as far as we know, from journalists at a court, which means you don't get a free pass anymore. When we first discussed with Jamil and Kerry about the possibility of this complaint, we thought we had an opportunity to do something not on behalf only of us, but on behalf of all the journalists that have been targeted, that have not had the opportunity to fight back. This is why this complaint is so important, Sheila.
Carlos, can you talk a little bit? You face all sorts of threats. There was a time I remember you couldn't even leave your apartment, or if you did, you had to go in an armored vehicle. You faced physical threats. How is digital surveillance different from physical threats?
Well, it changes a lot of things. When you realize that some people that are not exactly friendly with you or that have no legitimate interest in your personal life are basically living with you. They have been living with you for hundreds of years, of days, I'm sorry, and turning on your microphone, turning on your video camera without you knowing it at all. They have access to all your information, which means they know who are your dear ones, they know where they live. It's not only about the sources, it's about your personal life too. So it's very invasive. And of course, when we decided to publish this, it is not only the personal but the professional consequences of it. And of course, being journalists, one of the most difficult things is to accept to become the story. This is part, I think, of the success of these kind of things, that it demands a lot of resources from journalists to defend ourselves, to talk about this, to become the story. I have invested so much time on this that I could have invested on investigating corruption, on investigating human rights abuses, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
How is the morale of nearly your entire staff was being surveilled for several hundred days. How has it affected the morale of people in El Faro?
Well, it affects especially the families, right? Because suddenly the husband of a reporter tells her, look, they crossed the line. They now have the pictures of our son. Okay, you do whatever you want with your life, but not with our son's life. And of course it creates problems, different problems at each one's home. In the beginning, we were so focused on finding out everything about the invasion of our phones, that we crossed the Citizens Lab charter of the intromissions in our phones with our news cycle to determine when it was more intense. And of course, it coincided with our biggest stories. Shortly before and after we published our biggest stories about corruption, about deals with gangs, then it was it was so clear, like such a red point of the invasion in our phones. But we invested a lot of months during all the investigation, focused on that, and then on how are we going to tell this to our readers. We accompanied it with an editorial that was dedicated to our sources, saying we did everything we could to protect you, but now we know this. Someone could have your name. What I'm trying to tell you is we didn't have time to think about the personal consequences until we published. And then I think I told you this, Ronan, for your story. When we had already published this, then I had time to sit down and realize what had happened. And I felt so invaded that I went to take a shower. I felt like I was dirty with something. But again, then comes the thinking, what are we going to do besides denouncing this? I mean, are we going to stay just here receiving whatever comes after this? I am very insisting on this, but I want it to be very clear. This is why the complaint is so important for us.
Ronan, I'd like you to piggyback on what Carlos has said. You've written about, we all know the free speech consequences of spyware and digital surveillance, but less about the privacy consequences. Privacy is a right all of us have. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also to address the point of deterrence. Is it possible, really, to discipline this industry, which is very sinister and secretive and operates across borders? You've been reporting on not just NSO, but on the global spyware industry. Is it actually feasible to stop spyware?
I think, to Carlos's point, it's important for us all to understand that surveillance isn't just information gathering, it's a form of intimidation. And the consequences of that are both personal. I have faced various forms of both human and digital surveillance, and what Carlos describes is exactly right. You feel violated. You fear for your loved ones, you fear for your sources, you do feel intimidated. It does have a chilling effect on your ability to live your life, both your private life and your professional life. And nowhere feels safe at a certain point. And that's, therefore, a weapon that's being directed at people like the ones in this room. That's not just a watchful eye, that's harm. So I think when the NSO group argues, as they often do, that they're essentially an arms manufacturer, that makes a lot of sense to me. And their general counsel, who often advances those arguments, has worked for arms manufacturers. So it's very convenient for them to say, well, this is not new. All kinds of companies make weapons. And it's not our fault that this is a specifically unregulated space. We're just waiting for someone to put in place an international framework like the Geneva Conventions, and then we'll abide by it. But for now, we're doing our best. This is the argument they make. The part of that is a comparison to the arms world and that argues that there should be more international framework is very much accurate. And this leads to your question about what's possible. It is not some bleeding heart, pie-in-the-sky fantasy to regulate an industry like this. Nor is it a fantasy to use impact litigation to create incentives for an industry like this. I mean, if you look at the history of industries that thrive on harmful product, right? Big tobacco, big oil, opioids. There are precedents for, I'm an attorney, and one of the reasons I'm interested in the law is that you can use case law to create better incentives for those industries. Do I think that history teaches us that a desirable product like this can go away? No. Do I think that you can absolutely create a chilling effect around the most harmful practices in an industry? Yes. And the kinds of big class action suits that we've seen in some of those other industries that have created a cost and are maybe, hopefully in the process, of generating better practices and minimizing the most harmful practices, I think you could absolutely see something in this world of spyware. I want to make the point that, I have a very separate role in all of this from people like the folks at the Knight Institute. I'm watching from the outside. But the reason I'm watching is not just because I have personal experience of this kind of harm, which I do, but because I believe in that potential for change, and all of us as journalists want to watch those moments. We are living in a time of great change around this industry, and documenting that feels important, as does, with very different incentives and a very different end of the spectrum of activity around this, the work of lawyers like Jamil and like Carrie.
Carrie, can you talk more about that? What are the pressure points, the legal pressure points? What consequences would this case, because this is not the only case against NSO, Apple and Meta have filed cases against NSO. There have been, in other countries, there have been lawsuits filed as well. What do you, not so much the outcome, but what would incentivize, if you're talking about incentives, what would incentivize NSO to shape up, or at least, think about its most egregious practices?
Yeah, well, I think we have some indication into NSO's concerns surrounding being held liable for violation of U.S. law and U.S. court, given how hard it has fought to establish that it's entitled to foreign sovereign immunity, that it's entitled to be treated like a foreign government and therefore immune from suit in U.S. court. And it appealed that issue all the way up to the Supreme Court in the WhatsApp case that you mentioned, which WhatsApp filed in 2019. And the Supreme Court recently declined to take that appeal. So the appellate court decision stands, holding that NSO Group is not like a foreign country. It's not entitled to foreign sovereign immunity, and therefore its actions can be subject to review in U.S. court. And so I think that's some indication that they're really concerned about a lawsuit like the ones that WhatsApp and Apple have filed, but also like the ones that Carlos and his colleagues have filed. And so that's a great kind of initial victory for these kinds of lawsuits in the United States, and really clears the path forward. The other thing I would mention is that it seems absolutely necessary to come up with a global regulatory framework, if one is possible, to align the sale of this kind of mercenary spyware around the world. But at the same time, NSO Group and companies like it should be held accountable for violating US law, which NSO Group, to our mind, clearly did in this case. There's an anti-hacking statute on the books from the 80s that we argue NSO Group has violated in constructing and facilitating the attacks against Carlos and the other plaintiffs. And that's the statute that WhatsApp and Apple rely on as well.
Well, these lawsuits also have consequences, say, on the investors in the company, right? And we're just talking about the courts, but there could be executive department regulation that's possible. Can you talk a little bit about those other things? Yeah.
Yes, so to the latter point, we've been incredibly encouraged to see the Biden administration taking fairly strong action against NSO Group specifically, and taking the threat of the sale of foreign spyware quite seriously. So in late 2021, I believe it was, the Biden administration added NSO Group and a few other spyware companies to the entity list, effectively blacklisting them in the United States. We understand that the Biden administration will, hopefully soon be coming out with some further executive action on that front. And meanwhile, the US Congress has taken this threat quite seriously and held hearings over the summer with testimony from folks from Citizen Lab, from a victim of spyware attacks, from Google, and there's draft legislation that would also limit at least the US government's purchase of this kind of foreign spyware.
Let's talk a little bit about the link between digital surveillance and physical security. Right? If you're being surveilled, I mean, they know what you're doing, but does that also put your life or your safety at risk? I'm asking you, and I'll ask Ronan as well, because he's been reporting on this. Yeah.
In our specific case, which is what I can talk about, it was accompanied by other kinds of surveillance, physical surveillance, death threats, drones on our windows. One entered into my apartment, actually. Because in the end, the aim is to silence you. They want to intimidate you, but they also want to know who your sources are, to intimidate them. And I think that sources are way more vulnerable to be intimidated than journalists, because in the end, we are public figures. In the end, the price for attacking us is always higher than to attack anonymous people or people that work in some institutions that are filtering information to us. But usually in autocratic regimes, surveillance goes hand in hand with other kinds of physical threats to journalists and human rights activists mainly.
Carlos, you're not returning to El Salvador anytime soon because of, credible threats against your safety, correct?
I have not decided it yet, Sheila, but
Okay.
let me add something else. I also think that this complaint should be an example or something that is more and more important. I am very pessimistic, and I think the situation will get worse. I think that we are seeing an erosion of democracy throughout the world, and the rise of more and more autocratic governments. Journalists and activists, civil society, we usually are in the front line. The Knight First Amendment Institute is an academic institution. I think this should also be an example of how the academy, that has so much knowledge concentrated, so many resources, intellectual and financial resources, can leave the ivory towers and put all this knowledge and all these resources in the service of the people that are in the front lines. This is exactly what the Knight First Amendment Institute is doing, at least in our case, and I hope this serves as an example.
So Ronan, I'd like you to address 2 points. What physical and digital security, the link, but also who are journalists' allies, which is what Carlos started. Who are the allies of journalists in this fight against digital surveillance?
Well, to the question about how the two are linked, if you look at this writ large around the world, many of the watchdog groups that monitor this issue have run the numbers on this. It's not a mystery. You can, cross-check all of the cases of violence against journalists and dissidents and all of the cases of surveillance, and there's a lot of correlation. There's a lot of overlap in those Venn diagrams. And generally, the watchdog community on this puts the number of incidents of violence that were connected to surveillance in some way, or adjacent to surveillance at the very least, in the hundreds in just a very recent time frame. So the two are absolutely linked. They are mutually reinforcing, right? So, for example, I've had my phone geolocation data used to follow me around in person. That's very easy. It can go in the other direction, too. The argument of critics of NSO's alleged role in the Jamal Khashoggi case argued that the link there was that communications the Saudi authorities didn't like were uncovered through surveillance of people around him. So the two are deeply connected. In terms of allies, you have to look at the journalists being targeted not just as journalists but as human beings, right? And victims of this kind of surveillance need all the help they can get from the activist community. Very separate jobs, again, that journalists and activists have around this, But in this case, journalists are not just journalists, right? If they're being targeted, they become the story, they become victims, and they need the academic outfits like the University of Toronto, which houses Citizen Lab. They need the NGO community, places like Amnesty International that validate that testing, do their own testing. Outfits like Access Now. The activist community has been really integral, and to Carlos's point, the academic community too, which is deeply connected to that. And the power of impact litigation is really significant in a case like this, where we're on the bleeding edge, we're seeing the conversation take shape in real time. And yes, maybe in the end, the argument Kerry makes that US law has already been broken will carry the day. But we need the cases to support that. We need the case law to accrue and to become not just a strong argument, but a crystal clear one that's inescapable.
So, Carrie, are you hoping to set a precedent in this case? Precedent not just for NSO, but for other spyware companies?
Absolutely.
Well, yes. Well, we hope, right? But tell me what it would take. I mean, how long is the process?
Yeah, unfortunately, the courts move pretty slowly in the United States and probably quicker here than elsewhere. As I mentioned before, NSO Group has been putting up initial fights to even being dragged into court in the first place, and it's lost some of those initial fights in the WhatsApp case. But they're still, going to try to get these cases kicked out at early stages, especially before these cases enter what's called discovery, and they might have to turn over information about their dealings with the clients in the case of Carlos and his colleagues at Faro, and turn over information about how they sell and market and operate their product. The WhatsApp case will actually move toward that stage of the litigation sooner rather than later, and that's encouraging. But these cases will take a few years, especially if you factor in appeals and kicking and screaming along the way. And I think in the meantime, that's where the work of the journalists and the researchers come in to continue to hold NSO Group and other spyware manufacturers like it accountable in the press and in their public reporting and in the amazing analytical work that they do, uncovering the stories of these victims, informing the victims themselves. And on that note, I'll just mention the role of the tech companies as well. Apple and WhatsApp, have notified victims, and that's an encouraging sign. They should continue to do that and use the knowledge and resources that they have to continue to combat this threat.
It's very rare that journalists are suing the same company that Apple and Meta are. So this is really something new. We're in new company here. But let me ask maybe a more technical and legal question. How strong is the evidence against NSO? I mean, in your article, Ronan, NSO said that, what we have so far, the evidence that journalists have put forward so far, rely on probabilities and circumstantial protocols rather than on actual forensics and evidence. And that Citizen Lab and Amnesty International are unable to differentiate between NSO's tools and those of other cyber intelligence companies.
Yes, that's how they responded to our case and in other instances as well. They've been trying to discredit the work of the painstaking researchers at Citizen Lab and Amnesty International, Security Lab, and other organizations. I'll just say a few things on that point. So first, these organizations really show their work. They present their analysis, and they show the extent, they show what they can conclude from that analysis, and they also acknowledge what they can't conclude from that analysis. So their reporting itself is quite thorough. Beyond that, institutions and organizations around the world have validated it. So Citizen Lab and Amnesty International have independently validated each other's work, but on top of that, Apple has relied on it, WhatsApp has relied on it, Google cites to it. The computer scientists and engineers at these tech companies are, not lightweights. So I think we can look to that validation as well. And on top of that, the evidence that Citizen Lab and Amnesty International and other groups have put forward is going to be tested in court. It has already started to be tested in UK court in particular, and the one court found it incredibly credible and relied on it, to the full extent it was presented. So the same will be true in our case. The court will get to weigh the evidence against NSO Group's assertions that it can't be relied on.
Ronan, you wrote this piece, and you're kind of like an independent observer of this process. Do you think there is enough evidence to hold NSO to account?
Well, I approach both the claims of spyware vendors like NSO and the findings of watchdog groups like Citizen Lab with great skepticism. That's my job. And I think Carrie is correct in looking at the landscape of highly critical computer programmer, software engineers at these companies, and seeing their validation of these findings, seeing that there's an array of different independent groups that have independently come to the same conclusion. And you walk away from all of that, and you get a reasonable sense that this isn't just cooked up by groups with an activist agenda that is non-substantive. Citizen Lab in particular has been assailed by NSO Group with arguments that are oriented around anti-Semitism, that are oriented around geopolitical malice to do with their backers in the international community. As far as I have been able to tell through scrutinizing this closely over 4 years of reporting or something, that doesn't really hold water. These are pretty established findings, broadly speaking. It is the case that there are limits to them. And one thing that we all have to be watchful about is the fact that this industry may get better and better at covering its tracks. One of the core functionalities of Pegasus is to conceal that it was ever on a phone, to make it difficult for watchdog groups like the ones we're talking about to come to clear conclusions. So groups like NSO that make arguments about the deficiencies of the findings, bear in mind, they're also working really hard to make the findings deficient, and that makes the case for further scrutiny and further regulation all the more urgent. This is a problem that is not only becoming more ubiquitous, and for both journalists and, as I mentioned before, non-journalists, it's also a problem that is going to become harder and harder to track.
Carlos, do you want to weigh in with what you found in your particular case? I mean, you did say that there was an entry from El Salvador, but that doesn't prove that the Salvadoran government is the one.
No, it doesn't. As I said, it's a government in El Salvador. That's as far as we can go, because NSO themselves have declared that they only sell their spywares to governments, right? So it is a government, and it is in El Salvador. That's as far as we can go. There's not too many choices. But look, Sheila, what makes us special is us at El Faro is that it was so obsessive, and there was so many of us. It was not only the newsroom, even people from the management department of El Faro was infected with Pegasus, but that's it. We are not the only journalists infected with Pegasus in the world. I mean, you remember the Pegasus project from 2016, the Mexican case. It's hundreds and hundreds of colleagues all around the world. The other thing that makes us special now is that we have filed a complaint, but as Kerry said, we expect not to be the last ones. We expect this to open a door so that colleagues all around the world find tools to defend themselves.
So can you, for example, make a link between what they found in your phones and the other charges against you? You've been charged for money laundering and all sorts of other things.
Yes.
Is there a link between those two things, the surveillance and the subsequent lawsuits or charges? Yeah.
No, we haven't determined that. No. We don't know what they have, right? And I mean, the day they start distributing personal information from us, it will be obvious who was it. And they are still happy denying that they have used Pegasus against us. But again, Sheila, I think that we need to explore the control over, international control over these companies, because we're not the only case, and this is not the only spyware out there. It's only getting worse and worse for us.
So, what arguments does the spyware industry have to justify their existence? And would these arguments be persuasive to the international community, quote unquote? And would there then be a hindrance to regulating them or having a framework for their behavior?
Bear in mind that there's not really good guys in this conversation, geopolitically speaking. It's not like, you know, the U.S. government is totally hands clean and has all these wonderful incentives just because the Biden administration happened to blacklist a couple of companies. You know, they, in one of my stories on this, came out with a new announcement that they were going to essentially bar U.S. government offices from purchasing international spyware that poses a security or intelligence risk. And all of those subordinate clauses that come after the commitment give you a sense of how mealy-mouthed they want to be about this and how hard it is to get an actual principled commitment. An actual principled commitment would involve tying the hands of people in the national security state. It would involve curtailing the use of these fun toys that the intelligence community loves, the law enforcement community loves. Of course, if you are trying to catch certain types of criminals, it's super useful to be able to look at their phones. And that incentive is never going away. So it is much like the world of weapons of mass destruction. You know, we have to live with this new reality. And we're kind of living in a liminal space right now where the technology has arrived to make every device we own, every phone we put in every pocket, an ear and an eye for potentially an unfriendly adversary. But we're not yet at the point where the public recognizes that, has internalized that, is acting on that. You know, you do interviews inside these spyware companies. I remember sitting down at NSO Group for an interview with their CEO at one point in these years of reporting on them, and they make a lot of spyware jokes. It's a lot of like, oh, those nuts, we've seen those already. Like, we saw those when you emailed them last night. I'm like, not funny, guys. But like, it's also not a joke, right? Like, that's the world we're about to live in, where every communication is completely non-private. And there's a lot of really destructive consequences for that. There are all sorts of professions that rely on privacy as an essential right. You know, the medical profession, journalism, the list goes on and on. So you know, I think this is a frightening new reality, and I don't think, personally, that the realistic answer is to try to will it away or fight it off. I think it's going to require a new infrastructure that incorporates this as part of our reality.
I'm not a lawyer, but can there be an argument made for the constitutional right to privacy, and that the spyware companies are violating that right egregiously? Because your lawsuit is not about privacy; it's about violations of the Computer Fraud Act, right? Yeah.
That's right. I mean, there's one wrinkle in this case, which is that the defendant in this case is NSO Group, and under U.S. constitutional law, there's something called the state action doctrine, which means that you basically have to be suing a government official or government entity in order to raise constitutional claims. It's government agencies and government actors using this spyware outside of the United States, and the FBI at one point very seriously considered and tested Pegasus under a contract that they entered into in 2019. And if the FBI were to then deploy the spyware in the United States, then I think absolutely you would look to the Fourth Amendment as well as the First Amendment to raise a constitutional challenge there.
Good. So I think you've been sufficiently scared by the presentation. You're all every one of you who has a smartphone, it's your turn now to ask questions. So do we have microphones out here? Yes. So, is there a mic? Okay, yes, we have a microphone. So why don't you guys just come up front so that we're not passing the microphone around, and then just line up here like the upright citizens that you are. And then please introduce yourself and then say to whom you're addressing the question.
I was sweating bullets, by the way, thinking Professor Coronel was going to ask me to explain con law on privacy rights. Some rusty 1L knowledge.
I was going to ask you about the technical details of figuring out who put the spyware. I want to explain the code to me.
Yeah, we can do that.
All right.
Thanks,
Yes,
all. That was incredibly fascinating. My name is Praharsh. Briefly externed with the Knight Institute, so really excited to be here. My question is actually for Ronan. In your reporting, did you get a sense that there is a movement towards an international regulatory framework, or will it take an inciting incident? Will it take some sort of global catastrophe for this to actually become a subject of concerted international effort?
I do fear that that's the case, the latter scenario, that we're going to have to be shaken awake on this issue, that, for example, it's going to have to cause a lot more harm on U.S. soil to get a power like the United States to really get in gear on this, and in a substantive enough way that it counteracts the fairly compelling arguments of the security community in favor of the unfettered use of this kind of stuff. It's tough, you know. We are not built as an international community to address long-term challenges. You know, look at what's happened around climate change. So I fear you might be right. Yeah, I would say, though, that it's always a privilege to be able to report on our profession and on newsrooms like the Faro newsroom. And one of the sources of optimism in all this for me is just seeing how they keep going. And specifically in the case of Faro, how they turned around and, despite the fact that they had become a part of this story, really doubled down on telling that story. And I think, in a sense, to the question that was raised earlier about the allies of journalists in this fight, journalists are their own best allies. And telling the story of what's happening with this technology and the human devastation that's resulting is the highest calling I can think of, you know, within this whole morass of players around this. We need the public to understand how widespread this is and how dangerous it is as a first building block towards the kind of change you're asking about.
Thanks.
Can I add something to that? This is like the viral meme of the Spider-Man pointing to the Spider-Man. When you get this conversation to governments, for example, the European Union, right? I was in Brussels not long ago talking to some of the European parliamentaries. Some of them have been infected with Pegasus. They even have a special commission for that. But look, Spain was spying on the Catalonian parliamentaries. Poland has admitted it's using Pegasus. So basically, they are talking about how to control this when their own members are using it in incorrect ways. So it's very difficult to expect that they will punish themselves for doing this. That is part of the problem with expecting or hoping for international control. That who will put this control in place? Governments, and governments are the ones using this. Sorry for the optimism.
Can I go?
Yes. Yes, please. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Alrighty. So you've been talking about private suppliers of spyware. Let's say a government like the Chinese or the Iranians or the North Koreans have their own spyware and use it to spy on us or anybody. What remedies do you have? What legal remedies? I mean, I don't think there are any legal regulations or consensuses, but is there any political or diplomatic way of solving those? I mean, they can run away from the private companies and start developing their own spyware in the future. So what remedies do you think would be possible? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for starters, it's difficult, as I kind of mentioned before, it's difficult to hold foreign governments accountable in U.S. court for the violations that they commit, thanks to the doctrine, the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Doctrine. That said, you know, there are some causes of action that allow for some limited cases to proceed, you know, the Alien Tort Statute and others. But I guess you shared a note of pessimism about that course of action, and I think that's right. You know, that's probably where international sanctions regimes come into play.
Yes, please.
Thanks. I'm Peter Mysek with Access Now, so it's really nice to be here with you all. Yeah, and I appreciate your constant reference to the work of civil society and NGOs and working with independent journalists. And you know, it is a bit of a makeshift kind of duct tape and chewing gum system that's been set up, but with these rigorous academic standards, I think, especially at the Citizen Lab, has been able to maintain. It's shown to be resilient. But yeah, I am hoping the baton can be passed a bit more to governments. And I guess my question is, do you given that was it 12 or 14 EU governments seem to be customers of NSO Group, do we think that these tools are safe in any hands? And I guess my second question would be, why has NSO not been hacked yet? I think that's what contributed to taking down Hacking Team itself. Thanks.
So who wants to take on either question? Yes.
I can't answer any of those questions, but I do want to to thank Access Now for the work you're doing. I mean, you were the ones that first discovered Pegasus on our phones. And just 3 weeks ago, I was with someone from your organization checking again my phone. It's clean today. But you guys are doing a very important work. You guys, Citizen Lab, Amnesty International, in our case, have been, they are the ones that told us what was going on with our phones. So thank you very much. Now,
it's nice to have friends, Carlos, right?
Yes.
But the question was, are there legitimate uses? Are there defensible uses for spyware? Well, it is a big discussion around this. I think that, Kerry, you can address it better, the discussion about the limits of invading privacy, even if it's for criminals.
Yeah, I mean, every country has their own kind of civil rights framework or lack thereof, but I think, you know, to Peter's question about can we expect governments to really come to the table and agree on some kind of regulatory framework when they themselves are using this spyware, and what might that look like? I do think there's a big kind of open question about whether or not spyware like Pegasus, which is really limitless in its scope and capabilities, can ever be brought into compliance with international human rights norms and, you know, basic concepts of proportionality and United States concepts of minimization, et cetera. I mean, this spyware gives its operators access to your daily lives. And so, you know, I'll speak for myself. I personally have doubts about whether or not some framework could be put into place that really does defend human rights, but I know others disagree. And I mean, I think it's important work to really pursue to think about whether or not governments could be allowed with you know, proper predicates for investigations and proper oversight to deploy the spyware in limited circumstances. But I've already shown my cards.
Ronan, I'll toss the second question to you. Why hasn't NSO been hacked?
It's an interesting question. You know, it suggests they have pretty good security infrastructure. The activist hacker community is certainly pretty fearless in other cases. I've been to those offices. It's not a fortress. You know, I don't think that kind of activist hacking is a solution, you know, to all these vast problems. I think we're going to have to contend with, as our questioner there raised, not just this flourishing industry that extends far beyond NSO in terms of private actors, but the full array of world powers and even smaller powers using this kind of technology. You know, and Carrie made some interesting points here. I do tend to think that the least of evils, when we look at possible outcomes to this debate, is just the most transparent and robust regulatory framework, you know, the most checks on the power of governments to use this kind of technology without oversight, the most judicial oversight specifically. And we're a long way away from that right now. I mean, I remember working in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a junior State Department guy and just being bowled over by the culture of overclassification about all of the stuff we were doing intelligence-wise, militarily. You know, we had this crazy conversation going about drone strikes where, like, every outlet in the world was reporting on it, but we were pretending it wasn't happening in our public comments. And that's since shifted, and a lot of that stuff has become declassified. But I think we're in a similar situation here, where our greatest enemy, the greatest enemy of accountability, is overclassification, too much secrecy. People who want not just to use these tools for what I think are fairly characterized as legitimate law enforcement objectives, but want to do so under a complete blanket of secrecy and without accountability or oversight. And I don't think hackers are going to solve the problem.
They're psychologically satisfying to some people. Yes, please.
I want to ask y'all to let me know if you think that, I'm so short, during Obama's tenure and his very, very aggressive tracking of journalist sources, his use of the Espionage Act to, his use of the Espionage Act to go after the sources, and his really unprecedented spying on journalists opened the Pandora's box. We are supposed to be a hallmark for democracy, and this was something that was largely ignored. If you ask 9 out of 10 people on the street, chances are you're going to get 10 out of 10 that don't know this. The media was sort of silent. Okay, that's my question.
So can I have a few more questions, because we want to get you out of here by 9 o'clock. So let's hear from you, Nate, and then we'll pass on the questions to the others.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. I was wondering.
Oh.
Did not anyone want to address that?
We'll get some questions. We'll get a couple of questions and then have them address the questions. Yeah. Sorry.
I want to speak to Ronan. You mentioned that the way that these companies are structured, they're incentivized to go to autocratic regimes, and I'm curious, how are these companies monetized? Like, what's their profit structure? Is it like a set contract, or is it by use? How does it work?
So one more question, and then we'll have some answers here. Yeah.
I run a data agency specialized in freedom of access to information in Brazil, and we know, not officially, but that we might have some attacks there. So I'd like to know, how can I protect my team today, and how has that changed the way you do reporting with your team? How do you communicate? How do you work today?
Right, good point. So let's start with the Obama question. You're saying that journalists have been accused of espionage when really they're more victims of espionage. Right?
I would be interested in Carrie's thoughts on this too. It's a pet peeve of mine personally that I bang the drum about a lot. The Obama administration was really destructive in this respect, and it's a really ugly legacy, and our questioner there is absolutely right that it's under-discussed, and I don't know what the question out of it was, but yeah, good point, you know, and it can't be said enough, and I try to write about it all the time, and
it's proportionality is the issue here. Yeah.
It's, you know, it set a really alarming precedent, And we're still dealing with the consequences for journalists and whistleblowers that they work with.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just agree that the Obama administration really ramped up prosecutions of whistleblowers in particular under the Espionage Act, and that led, I think, pretty clearly to the Trump administration's prosecution against Julian Assange, the first time a publisher is being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and so we're definitely concerned about it. I'm not sure, you know, I think it's one of many ways in which journalism is under threat these days.
So the other question is, how does NSO make money?
There's no mystery to the structure of it. They send sales agents out to governments around the world and give a demonstration where they basically hack a phone in real time, and hopefully the officials in whatever intelligence agency or military unit they're demoing to, hopefully from their standpoint, respond with an ooh and ah, and then if it's a sleepy Western democracy, there might be a payout from that government or government office to NSO group that's in the single-digit millions, and if it's, you know, the Saudi account or a similarly repressive regime, it might be in the, you know, triple-digit millions, and that's the incentive that I'm talking about. You know, they make, according to those kinds of salespeople that I have spoken to, much, much more off of what critics might characterize as the bad guys.
So, Carlos, the question of how do you protect your reporting, your staff? Is there anything you can do if there's spyware on your phone?
First of all, I would recommend that you check your phones, and if you want, we can talk after this, so I can address you to people that can do that for you.
People should look for the Amnesty mobile verification toolkit. Is that what it's called? You can download a tool where you can do this test yourself.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised that there's a vast use of this, especially during the Bolsonaro years in Brazil. Now, how do we work? How do we work after that? We don't talk anything sensitive over the phone. I mean, you hear some things like Signal is better encoded than other messaging methods, but Pegasus, it is in your phone, so it doesn't matter what you do, they are seeing it live, no matter what app you use. So nothing is safe. So we don't talk anything sensitive over the phone, and we don't have phones when we meet. Not even when we meet over video platforms like Zoom or Google Meet, we don't have phones around. And of course, the difficulties come when we talk to sources, because I don't want to say publicly how we do now to communicate with sources, but I'll be glad to share with you after.
Carrier pigeons.
Yes.
There's the trick of wrapping your phone in aluminum foil. I saw it in one of your stories, right?
It is true that some of the NGOs who work on this issue, if they're in a real bind where there's a live infection happening right now, they have told people to just wrap the laptop in tinfoil, because it creates a Faraday cage, and it can block the transmission that might tell the spyware maker to shut off the infection and delete the software before it can be investigated.
You can get aluminum foil in the grocery across the street.
But I would just add to that, none of it is that mysterious, but there are steps that really help, that are almost as simple as tinfoil. Leave your phones out of the room if you're having a super, super sensitive conversation. If you're using remote communication for those kinds of conversations, do it on a burner device, an iPod that only has certain encrypted messaging applications on it, that's tied to a Wi-Fi hotspot that is not associated with the people involved. Reboot your phone every day. There are very simple steps. None of them are complete safeguards. There is spyware that can persist through a reboot, but much of the spyware out there actually can't. So it can be surprising how basic the steps can be that can have a real effect.
But the other thing is that you can get really paranoid with this.
Yeah.
And I don't like to live in such paranoid. So I just assume that they are listening to me all the time. And I'm especially careful with the sources, but the rest of my life, I just assume that someone has the possibility of looking at what you're doing. And that's the safest way to protect yourself.
Yes, Nina?
Hi, I'm Nina Dietz, and my question is actually about future lawsuits, assuming that the American intelligence community is not necessarily using Pegasus, as we've established, but something in that vein. When time comes for a lawsuit, given that Dobbs has very much curtailed the current constitutional interpretation of a right to privacy, how do you move forward in that new environment?
Okay, thank you. Can we have the other two questions, and then we'll toss the questions to our panel?
Yes, hi. My name is Alexander. I'm a Russian journalist, so I'm pretty much internalized the idea that you might be hacked at any time. So it's better you better just be ready for it. The question for me is, while the NSO's app technology might be more egregious and more effective than many others, there are many other surveillance technologies around the world. Like Moscow has this pervasive video surveillance system in the streets. We have tracking online by various corporations and government agencies. We've got like various technologies. Banking is being pretty tightly controlled. Isn't it, I don't know, useful to start a discussion about this whole layer of surveillance that is becoming pervasive, not just focusing on a specific technology?
That's a very good point. Yes, thank you. Professor Senini.
Hey, Sheila, first of all, thank you so much for putting this together. It's not only a great opening door, as Carlos said, for greater discussions on this, but also an opportunity to get along with other colleagues and to look at the issue from a multiple dimension, which is what you guys gave us tonight. I waited to be the last because students go first, obviously. But since I teach data and investigative journalism here at J School, and since the more I learn about data and how you use it, I don't use social media, or I know I'm like a dinosaur, but I think now people are getting more sympathetic with the idea of avoiding, for instance, now to becoming the guinea pigs of technology that has embracing technology that we still don't know how it works. So can we explore the possibilities of, I know it's kind of impossible because I've tried to get sort of off the grid, but can we explore not just addressing the issue with technology, but with human actions, and what actions would that be?
Okay, good point. Thank you. Those are all really good questions. The right to privacy post-Dobbs.
Yes, the contours of that right are up in the air at this point. But I think with respect to criminal investigations and the kind of classic Fourth Amendment right against unjustified searches and seizures, that's where you would look first. So I think so. You were talking about the U.S. intelligence community's use of something like Pegasus, even if it's not Pegasus itself. If the way that would come to light, I mean, as we've discussed, the government actors that use this kind of spyware do their utmost best to keep the use secret, and so the way that use often comes to light is through criminal prosecutions. And we have a sense actually that when the FBI was testing Pegasus, that the FBI and other agencies were really trying to figure out the constitutional and other legal bounds of the use of that kind of technology in the United States. And we filed a FOIA request to many of those agencies that the FBI included, actually, I think almost a year ago to date, maybe 3 days ago, a year ago to date. And so we're trying to gain access to the government's own understanding of how it can use this kind of spyware consistent with Fourth Amendment protections and other constitutional rights in the United States. And as Ronan referred to, thanks to overclassification and other secrecy problems, we're having a hard time getting a handle on those documents, but we'll keep fighting.
One thing I would interject here is, just as an outside spectator, as a reporter on this, I know of non-public examples of U.S. government offices purchasing foreign spyware, and they have sets of protocols for, in their minds, validating the fact that the specific software being used is going to be less controversial. I think that everyone is conscious of the NSO story, so they're working with other vendors. I think people in the burgeoning spyware industry understand that the U.S. government is a potentially really lucrative customer, both the federal government and state and local law enforcement. But the kinds of documents Carrie's talking about, they exist. And, there's offices at the Pentagon, at DOJ, that have drafted up memos about what they think the standards should be. And all of that is totally secret. And that's something that I think should worry all of us.
So there's a question here about, should we be worried not just about spyware, but more broadly about whole world of digital surveillance? And we're talking about regulatory frameworks or whatever. Should we not expand it beyond spyware?
Yes.
Yes. Did you get your answer? All right, so what I think the last question from Janina was, are there human ways to fight technology?
It's very curious that Janina asks this question. As you know, Sheila, Janina is a very close friend. We're both Central American journalists, but she is one of the world's biggest experts on data journalism, while I don't even know how to use PowerPoint. So it's very interesting that she asks this question. We refuse to live in fear, right? Part of the goals of targeting journalists is to intimidate us and to silence us. We have decided that silence is not an option. I mean, if you want to keep doing journalism, then silence can't be an option. Then you can learn to do other things in your life, but journalism is not, it's unacceptable to remain silent. But as I told you before, I refuse to live in fear or paranoid. I walk, I go to the streets, I don't live hiding from anyone. If there's someone following me, well, so be it. I am especially careful when I talk to sources, but not in my personal life. I refuse to live in fear. And I am very proud, if you allow me the arrogance, of the team that I work with, because they are all committed people, committed to what journalism means. I mean, despite all these threats, despite all the proved surveillance, they just keep working more and more. They do fantastic stories. They are not hiding anywhere. We just keep publishing more and more and more investigations. And I feel very proud of that team. I feel very proud of working with people so committed, so passionate, and so convinced of the role of journalism and the public services it does, even if the public does not agree, which is a completely different discussion. Right now, Salvadoran president is the most popular president in Latin America. 4 years in office, and he enjoys up to 85% of popular support. He has declared us a public enemy, which means a big amount of Salvadorans consider that we spread fake news, that we lie. That doesn't stop us from working. We don't work for the public, for what the public thinks it's their interest. Our commitment is not with our readers. Our commitment is with the principles of journalism. So we need to be rigorous, accurate, verify information, even if most of the public think that we are doing damage to our society. I don't know, this is another discussion.
But don't you agree, I mean, Rona and Kari, that we're putting so much of a toll on heroic newsrooms like El Faro's to defend the public interest, it's really kind of unfair, isn't it? That they're like the last, the last people standing between us and, I don't know, the abyss. I mean, it's heroic work, Carlos, but I'm saying it's not enough to have heroic journalists.
No, I'm sorry, Sheila, I don't think it's heroic at all. I mean, believe me, a lot of our colleagues around the world are going through way more difficult situations to do journalism, way more difficult. I don't think that what we do is heroic. What we do is what we do, and that's it. This is what we do, and that's it. We are privileged that we have a lot of visibility today, much more than a lot of our colleagues. And you don't have to go too far. There's Central American journalists that work into small towns that have been threatened by Russian mining companies that they don't even know who to call from their phones. People that have to run, our colleagues in Mexico, they are not facing death threats, they are facing death. Like really, hundreds of colleagues are being killed. I just say a lot of them feel abandoned because they are by themselves. So in that sense, I refuse to see myself as heroic or my team. We are very privileged. We have a lot of visibility. I mean, I'm right now at Columbia University, right?
Ronan, you've been covering journalists and spyware. What do you think?
I think you're both correct. Like so many moments of change and painful reflection around a problem that isn't quite new, but certainly a new form for an old kind of repression, it's going to require a constellation of different kinds of actors to do something meaningful about it. You need the journalists to cover the story of what's happening to this precious and embattled profession around the world. And one of the reasons I find it such a privilege anytime I'm able to play a role in that is because I'm so conscious of the truth Carlos talked about, which is that I live in a country with decent rule of law for all its foibles. There are journalists elsewhere, if you're in Pakistan, if you're in Russia, Belarus, if you're in so many places, who are staring down the very realistic prospect of death in a way that we don't here. And then it's also going to take more than that, to your point. It's going to take leaders and regulators and legislators who are willing to risk the wrath of the kinds of people we talked about in this conversation who are in government, who love these tools, who are able to make the courageous and necessary argument to the public that it's worth giving up some of those toys or curtailing their use. You're going to need academics and people in the NGO community to double down on the really crucial work that's already ongoing to hold this industry to account. And you need a public that awakens to this new reality and starts to see their phones not just as a boon but also as a threat, and hopefully starts to empathize with the people who are in the crosshairs of this technology, and through their votes, through their conversation, through what they put out there online and in person and in their communities, push for change, because we've arrived at the point we need it.
I think we should end there unless, Carrie, you'd like to have some final words about weaponizing the law on behalf of journalists rather than the other way around.
Well, I do think Ronan ended it quite well just there. I just want to say, one organization among many kind of press freedom organizations, but that stands right behind the front lines of the journalists like El Faro, is an organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the former director, Joel Simon, who's here, was instrumental in making this introduction and making this case possible. So, just add to the list of amazing NGOs who are doing the work of protecting journalists and protecting democracy as a result.
So many of the categories I just talked about, we all rely on the information we get from the ground. And so as a reporter, I need people like Joel and his successors at the Committee to Protect Journalism to say, hey, you know, this case is happening. Why don't you cover this? You know, hey, here's a lead, and you know that is a particular utility for someone in my profession of some of these NGOs that have an ear to the ground. But it can also be a role that just about anyone can play. You know, if any of you are studying these issues, experiencing these issues personally, you know, I'd make a selfish appeal for leads, and I would extend that to, you know, my colleagues in the wider profession. Like, if you know something,
say something.
Call in and say something. Yeah, my email for tips is right on my Twitter. It's one of the few non-hellacious applications of Twitter.com.
Be careful with the DMs, though.
Not that careful. Slide on in if you have a lead.
So we are a little bit over time, but thank you everyone for sticking around. This has been a fascinating discussion. And thank you to our panelists. It's been a great evening. Well, thank you to my students. I have a class today, so I brought my students here.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Sheila, can I add just a small thing?
Yeah.
A good friend of mine, Javier Valdez, who was killed 4 or 5 years ago in Mexico, he used to say, journalism needs people to embrace them. If we see journalism as a public asset, we need society to stand next to us, especially now that so many colleagues all around the world are facing more and more dangerous times. Again, a lot of them feel abandoned. We need society to accompany us.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for all the work that you do. All right, so this brings our program to an end. Thank you so much. So we need the love, ladies and gentlemen. Journalists need your love, so please send us love.
Thanks for coming, everyone.